The following presentation is brought to you by Discovery Education, leading the world of digital and video learning. Discovery Education, connect to a world of learning.
Get ready,
because today we're traveling to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania to explore American diversity. From shared values
to the courage of a few.
We're learning that diversity is our greatest strength.
So what are you waiting for? I'm Chris.
And I'm Tiffany, and it's all coming up today on TLC Elementary School. Get ready. Here's what's coming up today on American diversity.
When the Declaration of Independence was signed here on July 4th, 1776, it was official. We were Americans. But what does it mean to be an American? Take a look.
September 11th, 2001. America is under attack. In the days and weeks following September 11th, Americans unite. Across the nation, flags decorate lawns. Donations pour in. And Republicans and Democrats meet on the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. to sing God Bless America. In an instant, our differences are muted by the threat of terrorism and war. We are more than individuals. We are Americans. What does it mean to be an American? Unlike other nations whose citizens share a common ancestry, Americans come from many different backgrounds. When the United States was formed in 1776, shared values became the nation's common bond. These values would form the basis of our national identity and the beginning of our shared history. The Declaration of Independence would cement unalienable rights as America's belief in personal freedom. The Constitution's declaration of "We the People" would become the foundation for self-government. Yet the revolutionary ideas expressed in our nation's founding documents were not created overnight. American values were brought over with the first settlers. They came seeking freedom, religious tolerance, and a greater measure of self-government. But their ideas were not new. Early influences on American values stretch back more than 2,000 years to the ancient world. From Judaism and Christianity, our nation's founders would take the principles of justice, morality, and the equality of all people. From ancient Greece, where the city-state of Athens functioned as a democracy, they took the idea that citizens have the right to make decisions about their government. From ancient Rome, whose people set up a republic, they borrowed the idea that would allow citizens to choose government representatives. Colonial life would shape the vision of American values. For a long time, the continent's vast wilderness and distance from the Old World granted colonists unequivocal freedom. They did not have to accept second-class treatment when freedom was as close as the next area of unsettled land. As time passed, the colonists became increasingly self-reliant. They bought furniture made by New York carpenters, tools made by New England blacksmiths, and grains grown by farmers in Pennsylvania. They were no longer dependent on Great Britain for all their goods. The colonies were becoming independent. 1775. The seeds of discontent are brewing in the 13 colonies. Though they had once considered themselves loyal British Americans, the colonists now are foremost Virginians, New Yorkers, or Pennsylvanians. In a time when it takes 2 months to cross the Atlantic Ocean, the colonists scowl at the thought of being governed from 3,000 miles away. They would no longer accept British rule. They would now become the United States of America. Representatives from the 13 colonies gathered for the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. They were about to be entrusted with conceiving of and writing the most important documents of our nation. The Declaration of Independence would ring with the proclamation that all men are created equal and are entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The preamble to the U.S. Constitution, written a few years after the end of the Revolution, would safeguard our rights to self-government with the words, "We, the people." One nation, united by our values of equality, liberty, and self-government. Our nation's history had begun. The United States is a country built on utopian ideals, and yet there is no guarantee that people will live up to them. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, "All men are created equal," yet even Jefferson professed not to know the exact meaning of equality. A slave owner, Jefferson had made a distinction between free citizens who were entitled to equal rights and slaves who were not. And while the Civil War would later bring an end to slavery, it would not end racial oppression. Segregation in the Jim Crow era was tantamount to legalized racism. And for those who spoke out against racism, there were beatings, firebombings, and assassinations. Despite lofty claims that all men are created equal, equality is not an American birthright, nor is happiness or personal freedom. America's values are constantly in conflict. Yet our shared values are important. For it is in the aspiration of these values that we have seen the greatest social and political change. And if we have seen the darkest moments in our history in fear and prejudice, that we have seen the greatest moments in the history of our founders.
Did you know? America is often called a nation of immigrants. The most well-known American immigration center is Ellis Island. Between 1892 and 1954, millions of people passed through here in an attempt to become U.S. citizens. Today, 1 out of every 2 Americans has an ancestor who first landed at Ellis Island.
Now it's your turn to answer a question. How do shared values connect Americans? At the National Constitution Center in Philadelphia, you can learn about the rights promised to American citizens. But as history has shown, real-world actions or events can sometimes conflict with these rights. In those moments, it's up to each of us, as individual citizens, to promote social and political change.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Declaration of Independence. Our country was built on the ideals of equality, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But these ideals do not come with a guarantee that people will live up to them. And so, in each generation, Americans have united to demand greater equality under the law, bringing us ever nearer to forming a more perfect union. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. Frederick Douglass, 1857. (1776). Thomas Jefferson pens the Declaration of Independence. His words, that all men are created equal, inspire a nation. Under the ideal of equality, America is born. Yet while the nation celebrates this ideal, in reality, it is not a fixed rule of law or conduct. Slavery. In 1776, it is estimated that more than 500,000 enslaved Africans live in the 13 colonies. By the time the Constitution was drafted in 1787, the number had increased to nearly 700,000. Conditions of slavery were deplorable.
It is expected that slaves should be at work by the time it is light, and while at work they should be brisk. I have no objection to their whistling lively tunes, but no drawling tunes are allowed, for their work keeps time with the music.
With every sunrise, slaves faced the prospect of back-breaking work. With every sunset, they returned to harsh living conditions.
No day ever dawns for the slave, nor is it looked for. For the slave it is all night forever.
Born into bondage, most slaves knew nothing other than a life governed by the whim of the master, who had complete control over their lives. Many slaves were abused, and all suffered severe abuses to their human rights. Many slaves tried to resist or escape their owners. Sometimes this took the form of outright rebellion. In the 1830s, some Americans called for an end to slavery in the United States. These people were called abolitionists. One of the unexpected leaders of the abolitionist movement was an African-American man named Frederick Douglass. Douglass experienced great hardship as a slave in his early life. Douglass describes himself during this time as broken in body, soul, and spirit. Despite these deplorable conditions, he managed to learn how to read and write. At the age of 20, he could take no more and ran away. He arrived in Massachusetts, where he worked as a laborer for 3 years and became involved in the abolitionist movement. At an anti-slavery convention in 1841, Douglass was invited to describe his feelings and experiences under slavery. His speech was so articulate that he was immediately propelled into a new career as an abolitionist spokesperson. Skeptics doubted that such an eloquent spokesman could ever have been a slave. To combat criticism, Douglass wrote his autobiography, The Life and Times of Frederick Douglass. In it, he described the degrading slave system. His account became a classic in American literature. Douglass died of a heart attack in 1895 at the age of 77. But his work for the rights of enslaved African Americans would live on long past his death. Born at a time when strong voices were needed desperately to cry out for freedom, Douglass established himself as a powerful speaker and the father of the civil rights movement. It was we the people, not we the white male citizens, nor yet we the male citizens, but we the whole people who formed the Union. Susan B. Anthony. On November 2nd, 1920, more than 8 million women voted for the first time in American history. It was 144 years after Thomas Jefferson proclaimed equality as the foundation of our government that women were granted the right to participate in the electoral process. 2 women would spearhead the development and eventual success of the women's suffrage movement: Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony. Together, they would revolutionize the political and social condition of women in American society. In the early 19th century, women had few rights. They were barred from most professions. Opportunities to attend college were almost non-existent, and they could not vote. A married woman was legally the property of her husband. Everything she had belonged to him. But in 1848, a group of young women became determined to overthrow the customs and laws regarding women. They met in Seneca Falls, New York, at a conference on women's rights. Among those in attendance were Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, 2 women who would challenge America to launch a social revolution. While at the conference, Stanton and Anthony adopted a statement on women's rights deliberately modeled on the Declaration of Independence. In it, they would accuse the nation of entire disfranchisement of half the population and demand the rights and privileges that belong to all persons as citizens of the United States. Stanton and Anthony would also cement their battle for women's suffrage, or the right to vote, as the primary goal of their movement. They believed this would lead to the greatest social and political changes. Over the next several decades, their movement would inspire countless Americans to social and political activism. Stanton became the leading voice and philosopher of the women's rights and suffrage movement. And Anthony became the powerhouse of the movement, leading legions of women in the struggle for voting rights. They devoted 50 years to the women's suffrage movement, but neither one lived to see women gain the right to vote. Today, they are remembered for their unequivocal determination in fighting for equal treatment under the law. It may be true that the law cannot make a man love me, but it can stop him from lynching me, and I think that's pretty important. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. The African-American struggle for equal rights began when the Civil War ended. Although slavery was outlawed, Jim Crow laws in the Deep South segregated whites and blacks. Racial segregation, or the practice of separating institutions, schools, and community centers by race, continued to be practiced throughout the South until the mid-20th century. But eventually, a simple act of rebellion would start a revolution. In 1955, an African-American seamstress named Rosa Parks was riding a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Tired from a long day of work, she refused to give her seat to a white man and was arrested for violating a city ordinance that required her to do so. Rosa Parks became one of the many people who worked for equality in the civil rights movement. Her story would inspire the nation.
Well, we hope to achieve equal rights as any human being deserves. That's what we're working for.
Martin Luther King Jr. heard about Rosa Parks' story. To end segregation on the city's buses, he helped organize a boycott against the transit system. For more than a year, African Americans refused to ride the buses in Montgomery. Finally, on December 20th, 1965, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional. These important events began a nonviolent movement that aimed to end unequal treatment for African Americans. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a leading force in that movement. On August 28, 1963, King and other leaders led 250,000 civil rights activists in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. King delivered one of his most celebrated speeches on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial.
I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, sons of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will they be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream.
At the urging of President Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This law banned discrimination in all public facilities and in employment. King continued the struggle for equal rights, but his battle would end on April 3, 1968, when an assassin shot him on a motel balcony in Memphis, Tennessee. The civil rights movement had many triumphs and tragedies. But Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King Jr., and many others helped win for African Americans the equal rights promised to all citizens. There have been conflicts between our ideals and our reality. But citizens have been willing to fight for change. The abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, and the civil rights movement were all started by citizens who looked at the laws and saw that they were unjust. Like the brave Americans in our history, each of us has a responsibility to narrow the gap between the ideals of the Declaration of Independence and the realities of our society.
Did you know, thanks to our Constitution, political conflict in the United States is generally less divisive and violent than in other nations? Because the Constitution upholds an individual's right to peaceful protest, opposition in our country is usually resolved through democratic measures like voting.
Now it's your turn to answer a question. How can diversity promote social change?
Well, that's a wrap for today.
But tune in next time when we continue our exploration into civics.
So don't miss out. It's all right here
on TLC Elementary School.